Welcome to this first episode of Snapshots from Australia Together. I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of Australian Community Futures Planning, and in these programs we plan to showcase selections of strategies and policies that can establish Australia's future as a prosperous nation offering safety, security and well-being to everyone. The strategies presented here are not emerging from political processes. They're emerging through a process in which any and every Australian can become involved, the process of drafting Australia Together, our nation's first long-term integrated community futures plan. To find out more about this plan and the open, transparent, inclusive, democratic process being used to build it, visit the ACFP website at www.austcfp.com.au. This episode can be viewed in three sections. Section 1 is a brief overview of what Australia Together is and how it can help fix climate change. Section 2 is about the imperatives and targets for climate change in Australia Together, and Section 3 covers a selection of key strategies in Australia Together for dealing with climate change, including those for managing economic transitions, rebuilding for resilience, creating carbon markets and other new markets that will flourish in the 21st century economy, and finally, strategies for leadership and global cooperation. So, on to Section 1 about Australia Together. Australia Together is a plan that is structured to help any and all Australians travel safely from 2020 to 2050 and ensure that we arrive there with an acceptable degree of well-being and security. It is a plan being developed by Australians for Australians with the assistance of Australian Community Futures Planning. ACFP is a fully independent centre of excellence in national community futures planning. We have developed and are using a new community engagement and organising process called National Integrated Planning and Reporting, or National IP&R. Any and all Australians can use National IP&R within their democracy and their existing election cycles to work together to build their first ever National Community Futures Plan, Australia Together. And they can monitor our progress towards or away from our aims as a nation. We can keep our leaders on the safe paths to our preferred destination as a nation in the future. ACFP is also providing assembled research resources to help Australians build and report on their plan based on factual evidence about their well-being and security. Most importantly, with this plan in hand, built using a democratic national integrated planning process, Australians can form a new and much healthier relationship with those they elect to positions of power in democracy. They can present to their elected leaders for the first time a clear and coherent set of instructions about what we want them to do for us, for all of us, for we the people who elect them. It gives us a means of assembling ourselves to increase our shares of power in democracy, to set down the terms of a new social contract benefiting everyone, not just a few, and to make sure that elected parliaments have both the guidance and support they need from us to create the kind of Australia we want. Australia Together is a plan for the best society, environment, economy and democracy that Australians can imagine in the early 2020s, complete with a map of how to make it a reality by 2050 or sooner via the safest routes. It is a plan to help us ensure we arrive where we want to in the future. It is non-political and non-partisan. Viewers can read the drafts of Australia Together as they are being built and become involved in developing it into a stronger and stronger plan over time by visiting ACFP's website. ACFP has also provided video introductions to Australia Together on YouTube, and we've provided video explainers about national IP&R, showing how the whole process works to assist Australians to build their plan together. Links are in the description below. The most important feature of Australia Together is that it is an integrated long-term plan. This means it assembles suites of diverse but complementary strategies for overcoming our biggest weaknesses as a nation and for propelling us towards our preferred future. This makes it unlike any other plan that has been built in Australia before. The integration is entirely new in socio-economic planning, at least at the national level, and it is vitally important if we're to overcome the institutional failures and inertia we are currently experiencing as our state and federal governments and public services operate in silos. They are operating in an entirely disintegrated way without a plan that will enable them to coordinate their efforts or even attend to what is actually most important to Australians. So Australia Together is an entirely new opportunity to break down those silos, get governments and institutions working together, get governments focused on what is most important to us, and speed up our progress towards a better future. The plan is structured with a draft vision which itself has been built by examining the responses of Australians over the decade to 2020 whenever they've been asked about what they want for the future. The vision includes a set of directions which gives everyone a practical means of making the vision a reality via the safest routes. This is an inclusive vision. Everyone is meant to benefit. You can read the draft vision for Australia Together on the ACFP website and comment in surveys. Links to surveys and comment channels are provided in the description below. Because Australia Together puts diverse and complementary strategies in one place and integrates them, it deals very effectively with problems of inequality, cultural clashes, economic inertia, declines in health, education, productivity and biodiversity, corruption and exclusion in democracy, and of course, the big one, climate change. Australia Together works on an assumption that climate change will not be solved without an integrated plan, one that helps us address all the causes of climate change at the same time and together as Australians. Climate change has not just been caused by excess burning of fossil fuels. It's been exacerbated by overconsumption of non-renewable resources and by economic strategies which increase inequality and decrease both labour productivity and the sustainability of our consumption patterns. Climate change has also been aggravated by corporate irresponsibility, disregard of the national interest by politicians who've excluded Australians from a voice in their democracy, and by a total failure on everyone's part to plan for a better future. Climate change is happening faster than previously predicted, but it is we who are speeding it up through our failure to work together and develop an effective plan that will carry everyone safely through the necessary change. At ACFP, we've been working to develop a new process that Australians can use to build that plan for safe travel through the climate change challenge. That process is called National Integrated Planning and Reporting, and we've begun to apply the process and test it by using it to build what we call starting drafts of Australia Together. Already a strong set of diverse but complementary strategies is emerging as capable of helping Australia solve climate change by 2033. Australia, every other country, and the planet are all in serious trouble due to climate change. But we can fix it if Australia plays a fair part with other nations. It is still possible to prevent heating above 1.5 degrees Celsius, just as we agreed to do with every other nation when Australia signed the Paris Agreement in 2015. It is possible to cap heating at 1.5 degrees if we pursue the following targets and strategies, and if we start immediately. These targets and strategies have been selected and included in Australia Together by working on the basis of scientific evidence and on the basis of certain critical assumptions about what we need to do to succeed. The first of these is that it is imperative that Australia and the world will need to achieve net zero carbon emissions not by 2050, but by about the year 2033, or sooner, depending on when we start with these strategies and any others necessary to stop the heating. we have made no progress in emissions reduction in Australia since 2015, when we signed the Paris Agreement. With the exception of the 2020 year, which saw a sizable drop in Australia's carbon emissions due to the COVID-19 lockdowns, a drop we may expect to disappear when the pandemic is over, our domestic emission trends have remained generally flat, reducing by only 1.7% in total between 2015 and 2019. We won't reach net zero inside 50 years at this rate, and every year we delay shaves off a year of our time for dealing with the heating problem. A second imperative is that if we are to honour our commitment in Paris, we will need to ensure that Australia does not exceed a total carbon budget of about 3.5 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, we will have to achieve net zero without emitting more than this total tonnage of carbon between 2020 and 2033. I will explain how this total tonnage limit of 3.5 billion tonnes has come about as we move through the strategies, but for the moment it is important to note that the whole object of the exercise here is to get the heating to stop. We won't do that if we insist on emitting more than a fair share of what's left of the world's safe limit of carbon emissions. In its 2021 report on the physical science basis for global heating, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has calculated that the safe limit of total emissions from 2020 onwards to give the world a 67% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees of heating is 400 billion tonnes. That's the upper limit of what the whole world can emit in carbon if we wish to give ourselves a 67% chance of capping heating at 1.5 degrees. For Australia's purposes, however, a 67% chance of stopping the heating is not the best basis for a plan for a number of socio-economic reasons, not least of which is that if temperatures rise by more than 1.5 degrees, the cost of dealing with climate change impacts becomes so big that it significantly exceeds the cost of preventing the heating in the first place. This is a big problem for countries with small populations like Australia relative to their land area and their potential resource losses, particularly water and soil productivity for agriculture. This ratio means that the cost per capita in Australia of failure to meet the temperature targets is one of the highest in the world. And if we look at the picture of the total cost associated with failure to prevent heating, there is no good news there either. Based on research completed by Melbourne University's Sustainable Society Institute in 2019, the cost to Australia of allowing global heating above 1.5 degrees is about 16 times what it would cost to simply prevent the heating in the decade to 2030. I will refer more to this work later, but suffice it to say, heating above 1.5 degrees will be completely unaffordable for future generations of Australians. So in Australia together, it is assumed that the whole world can emit not 400 billion tonnes, but only about another 235 billion tonnes of greenhouse gases before we lock in irreversible destruction due to heating. Capping global emissions to 235 billion tonnes would give the world close to a 100% chance of keeping temperature rises below 1.5 degrees. Australia's share of that 235 billion tonnes is probably no more than 1.5%, since this was our share of actual emissions from domestic sources in 2019. 1.5% of 235 billion is 3.5 billion. Hence, in Australia together, it is assumed that keeping within that budget is the only way to safely, fairly and affordably work with the world to stop global heating. A third fundamental assumption is that global failure to achieve net zero by 2033 is likely to result in collapse of world financial markets and a global economic downturn that will dwarf both the global financial crisis of 2008 and the COVID-19 pandemic recession. This will severely impact the living standards and superannuation of all Australians up to the year 2100 and beyond. For more information on why accepting all these assumptions as imperatives is the minimum that we need to accept to future-proof Australia from the ravages of climate change, viewers may watch Episode 6, Part 2 of ACFP's 7-part videocast series on the state of Australia in 2020. This episode is about climate change and how to prevent global heating by strategies at home and by leadership abroad, both of which are necessary to defeat climate change. Links are in the description below. Other critical assumptions that have been accepted as a sound basis for the strategies I will set out include that availability of public funds is not a limitation in our case. Australia has all the financial capacity, wealth and expertise it needs to achieve net zero by 2033, as long as investment is planned, selected and incentivised on the basis of the national interest, not corporate interest. Also, as a nation, Australia saves and makes much more money by preventing heating above 1.5 degrees than we would by doing nothing or by slowing the pace of change. Because of Australia's particular competitive advantages in the world economy, the quicker we track to net zero, the more wealth we amass. Again, more detail supporting this is provided in Episode 6, Part 2 of the State of Australia in 2020. The next imperative is that a full transformation of the structure of Australia's economy is necessary. This entails a swift transition away from fossil fuels to an economy based on renewables, rebooted manufacturing and metals processing, and provision of increased social services domestically, including for health, education, housing, conservation and land care, aged care, child care, and disability care. The faster we run to this finish line on economic transition and on phasing out emissions, the cheaper the transition will be, and our economy will be much stronger and resilient to the shocks we can't control. It's important to remember that climate change presents a threat to our economy, but unlike some other threats, it is one we can control. It's a threat we can outwit, a disaster we can prevent, if we take up the strategies in Australia together. The next assumption is that all Australians need to be and can be carried safely across to this new structure for the economy. But there is also an assumption that current institutional arrangements are wholly inadequate for this purpose. After all, this is the biggest change in the structure of our economy that Australia has ever made. That means we need a major overhaul of critical institutions in the public service, and we must start now. The plan also assumes that corporate corruption must be prohibited if the change in economic structure is to be achievable, and corporate lobbyist involvement in the United Nations Conference of the Parties to the Paris Agreement, COP26, in Glasgow in November 2021, must be prohibited. Furthermore, the plan assumes that sound and ethical regulation of markets will be required, with incentives and stimulus geared towards pulling both Australia's and global emissions down in a steep straight line year on year to 2033, and that this will require Australia to reduce its own annual emissions of carbon by at least 38 million tonnes every year, year on year, between 2021 and 2033. Further, it is assumed that focusing on technology development such as carbon capture and storage will help, but only in very small part and in a small number of locations. And to the extent that government support for unproven or commercially unattractive and impracticable technologies such as CCS may allow corporations to delay switching to renewables, they're likely to be self-defeating. Nor is a gas-led recovery from the COVID-19 recession in any way a viable means of either securing our economy or rescuing the planet. With good reason, less than 15% of Australians favour a gas-led recovery, and the Australian Energy Market Operator likewise sees little or no place for gas in the efficient operation of energy markets in Australia. New gas developments are fully antithetical to achieving a target of net zero emissions. And for a multitude of reasons, new emissions reduction technologies, although they may be applicable in certain circumstances, cannot be relied on at all as a viable strategy for achieving net zero. In any case, it's already way too late to attempt to substitute technology strategies for actual cessation of fossil fuel use and expect that this will secure the planet from irreversible loss. Plainly, it won't. For a sense of the loss we are facing if we don't start immediately with the sort of strategies that are being assembled in Australia Together, viewers may wish to browse the 2021 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In formulating suites of strategies for climate change in Australia Together, ACFP has relied on sound scientific data in this and earlier IPCC reports. Finally, the strategies in Australia Together for fixing climate change are being selected to ensure we meet certain essential targets. These targets have been derived based on the science in the IPCC reports, and they have been embedded in Australia Together as the minimum necessary to achieve the vision. This means they're fundamental to the safety, well-being and security of every Australian. Viewers should understand that Australia Together is a map through time to a safe destination by 2050 or sooner. So every target and strategy has a map reference number to make it easy to follow. You can find the full detail about each of these targets and strategies in Australia Together by searching using the map reference number or a keyword search. The colour coding system also provides guidance as to where you can find a target or strategy in the plan that is of interest to you. Key targets for the purpose of fixing climate change are a target for Australia to emit no more than 3.5 billion tonnes of carbon to the atmosphere from 2020 onwards, and to reach net zero by 2033 without having exceeded that 3.5 billion tonne budget of emissions. This is a target for domestic emissions and excludes emissions from exports. This does not mean that emissions from exports can increase. They're to be eliminated too, but by strategies aimed at substituting carbon-intensive exports like coal or aluminium made using coal for other exports made through 100% renewable energy. A second target required to ensure Australia does not exceed a carbon budget of 3.5 billion tonnes is to achieve, by the 2030 year, a 79% reduction of annual emissions compared to the total load we emitted in 2019, and to reach that reduction target by even drops of approximately 38 million tonnes in loads emitted each year, year on year, or in whatever pattern may be organised to ensure that Australia stays permanently within the carbon budget of 3.5 billion tonnes. A third target is to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. These funds need to be shifted to use in emissions abatement and safe passage for Australians to the new economy. The next two targets are to convert Australia's energy supplies entirely to renewable sources by no later than 2030, and to ensure the full uptake of renewable energy by the various sectors of transport, agriculture, commerce and industry. This is a target for elimination of oil use and at least the vast majority of gas, or all gas except possibly hydrogen, if no genuine offsets are found. And the last target is essentially to restructure the Australian economy by 2030, at least from the point of view of energy sources and energy-intensive exports. This means elimination of fossil fuel use and replacement of carbon-intensive exports with new developments in mining, metals processing, agriculture and carbon credits trading. In effect, this is a target to make Australia a renewable energy superpower. This particular target does not describe the full nature of the restructure of Australia's economy that will be necessary to steer Australia safely through the climate crisis. Other restructures will be necessary in services in the domestic market. These will be the subject of a forthcoming snapshot from Australia Together on strategies for full employment with a social safety net. These targets may be added to over time. So, with these targets in mind, let's look at some of the strategies for helping Australia beat the challenge of climate change and do so fairly and affordably and in accordance with the imperatives I've just listed. These strategies are selected and integrated so that they can operate efficiently to help Australia to, first, manage the necessary transitions in our economy, second, rebuild vital national assets and infrastructure and establish resilience and preparedness for future shocks, third, create markets that will flourish in the 21st century global economy, and fourth, shift the nation onto the necessary footing of global cooperation and leadership. Global cooperation and leadership in emissions reduction is vital to Australia's ability to thrive financially. In effect, these strategies are being designed to create the best conditions in markets and a sufficient degree of publicly funded stimulus to allow us to embed the most efficient public and private sector contributions to the economic restructure, and at the same time, to ensure returns to Australians from whatever is invested in all this by taxpayers. This is a program for ensuring the highest possible efficiency in nation rebuilding after the recessionary effects of the GFC and the pandemic, but with sufficient protection of the interests of Australian taxpayers and their due returns on investment. It is always taxpayers who bear the vast proportion of costs and risks for economic transitions. This set of strategies is designed to ensure they get their due returns. It is a program for an economic restructure without increasing inequality. The strategies listed here operate alongside a number of other strategies for creating full employment and a whole range of other targets beyond climate targets. So the strategies listed here don't therefore represent the whole set of integrated strategies that will contribute to Australia's chances of meeting these climate change targets and establishing a new economy. Nor do they repeat the plans and strategies of other excellent planners such as Beyond Zero Emissions, the Climate Council, the Australian National Outlook, the CSIRO, the UTS Institute for Sustainable Futures, the Clean Energy Council, and the Australian Energy Market Operator, all of whom are active in the field of shifting Australia to a new economy. The following strategies simply help create the best conditions, policy frameworks, and incentives so that the plans of those agencies and ethical private interests can succeed. So, as of 2021, what are the most significant strategies in Australia together for climate change? I'll go through each of these in more detail, but so that we can orient ourselves, here's a list of the critical strategies that have emerged in the earliest drafts of the plan. Strategies to manage the necessary transitions in our economy include 1. The creation of a National Economic Transitions Commission. 2. Economic transition funding sufficient to drive sector-wide transformations with safety nets. And 3. Legislative programs for cessation of all new coal, gas and oil investments and phase out of existing fossil fuel investments. Strategies to rebuild national assets and infrastructure to ensure resilience and preparedness for future crises include 1. A new program of national electricity market system investment. 2. Development of a sovereign capability strategy for national resilience in global crises. And 3. Introduction of a prohibition on government contracts to private sector companies that do not have accredited plans to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2033. Strategies to create new markets that will flourish in the 21st century global economy include 1. A legislated program to increase GDP and returns to landholders and mitigate climate change at the same time by increasing native forestry cover and restoring degraded ecosystems. 2. Commencement of the development of a lucrative carbon credits market, starting with the creation of a publicly owned Carbon in the Land and Sea Finance and Trading Corporation. 3. A strategy to ensure maintenance of the Australian Clean Energy Regulator's internationally acknowledged capacity for ethical certification of carbon credits. 4. Reintroduction of a national renewable energy target. And of course, 5. Reintroduction of a price on carbon. And finally, strategies to shift the nation onto the necessary footing of global cooperation and leadership include an integrated and funded program for meeting Australia's commitments to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and establishment of a national forum for citizens' oversight of progress towards those goals. And lastly, the linchpin of them all, a proposal for a complete reformation of Australia's negotiating stance and conduct in Paris Agreement negotiations, so that we can ensure protection of our lives and livelihoods by committing ourselves to emit no more than our fair share of the remaining global budget of carbon necessary to stop planetary heating from rising by more than 1.5 degrees. This is just a small selection of strategies emerging in Australia together that underpin our chances of arriving safely in 2050 with an acceptable degree of well-being and security in the face of climate change. But they are significant in their capacity to underpin the transition efforts of others. There is a high likelihood that, unless we fill these policy gaps, the strategies of all those other players will fail. So it's worth having a brief look at how they can work and how they fill the gaps in our current policy framework. Starting with those strategies for managing economic transitions, the proposal to establish a National Economic Transitions Commission is a centrepiece. This strategy acknowledges that globalisation of economies and other global forces such as climate change or pandemics or trade wars will, from time to time, deliver sector-wide shocks to Australia's economy. They are currently hitting our fossil fuel mining sector, our tertiary education sector, the tourism sector, and they have been incrementally impacting our manufacturing sector for some time. So the National Economic Transitions Commission is a new institution to identify the necessary shifts in response and then facilitate the shifts into or out of whatever sectors are being affected by the global shift. The Commission's role is to do this by any supportive means that ensure long-term viability for the economy itself and safety for affected Australians. The Commission would have a Charter of Independence with a statutory requirement to protect the national interest, first and foremost, in its advice and recommendations to parliaments. It would have a quadruple role in facilitating 1. Timely identification of impending sector-wide disruptions to our economy. 2. It would facilitate transparent, defensible recommendations on policy for funding and management of required transitions. 3. It would have capacity to implement approved funding or stimulatory programs supporting the transitions. And 4. It would coordinate any multi-agency involvement in establishment of new market structures and regulations necessary to ensure the resilience of any new economic transformations. In summary, the role of the Commission is to steer us safely out of vulnerable industry sectors and into sectors where we have a competitive advantage in the forthcoming decarbonised global economy. Its first job would be to carry affected fossil fuel workers and any other related sectors safely across to the new employment sectors and rebuild any other sectors suffering from shocks from global events, such as the tertiary education sector and tourism. This is likely to require the creation of an economic transitions fund that, with the approval of Parliament, can be administered to assist workers in transition from one sector to another, or to boost the speed with which new competitive sectors can be established or expanded to build a path towards full employment. If the Commission is established, it will ensure Australia can efficiently organise its economic development and its passage through turbulent periods with a predictable degree of safety net support for workers in transition and a known safe landing place for those workers. This will enable everyone to get organised to make inevitable shifts. It will smooth the way for those facing impacts from closure of fossil fuel industries, closures which will now need to be accelerated due to Australia's past inertia in transition away from fossil fuels. This transition is consistent with what the International Energy Agency has already acknowledged as inevitable. The IEA is normally pro-fossil fuels, but they have now drawn the conclusion that the path to net zero emissions is essential and that it is now so narrow that staying on it requires immediate and massive deployment of all available clean and efficient energy technologies. They have concluded that there is no need for new investment in new fossil fuel supply in their net zero pathway. The IEA has determined that beyond projects already committed as of 2021, there are now no new oil and gas fields approved for development in their pathway towards reliable energy, and no new coal mines or mine extensions are required. The writing is on the wall for fossil fuel industries, but Australians need not suffer if we organise their safe passage through the change with the aid of a fully independent, well-resourced National Economic Transitions Commission, openly accountable to the people of Australia. We are starting late, but not too late if we set up the Commission now. Moving on to those strategies for rebuilding national assets and infrastructure to ensure resilience. A new program of national electricity market system investment is central to success. This mainly involves investment in new electricity transmission and the creation of renewable energy zones in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, South Australia, and probably in parts of Western Australia. This strategy has emerged in response to and support of the Australian energy market operators' release in 2020 of their new integrated system plan. This plan set out a step change program for electricity network investment in both generation and transmission necessary to build the lowest cost, secure and reliable energy system capable of meeting any emissions trajectory determined by policymakers at an acceptable level of risk. The good news is that this investment program will provide net benefits to Australians of over $40 billion. The strategy designed in Australia Together to support this is to establish a fully government-owned corporate Commonwealth entity, the Australian Renewable Electricity Investment and Security Corporation. The role of the new corporation would be to rebuild and modernise the electricity grid and establish renewable energy zone infrastructure as set out in AEMO's Integrated System Plan. This publicly owned entity would also make arrangements as needed with private sector contractors and capable government trading enterprises for delivery of infrastructure works. And it would borrow and invest for purposes of electricity security and for purposes of ensuring all net returns to the public. A state-owned corporation like this already exists in Queensland, and an Australia-wide public corporation could learn from and integrate with this. It may be expected that private sector interests will clamour to dominate this investment in new electricity transmission, meaning they may prefer to design, build, own and operate it. However, such a path should be viewed with extreme caution and rejected. Electricity transmission is a natural monopoly, and it would be inconsistent with too many of the directions and vision of Australia Together to allow private sector ownership and operation of such vital new networks, especially given that private operation and investment in the electricity network to date has delivered no benefit to Australians in reduced prices, and security of the network is far too difficult to ensure via privatisation. Based on past performance of the private sector in this area, it could not be expected that private sector control of power networks would ensure that Australia could be confident of sovereign capability and national resilience in a crisis such as a pandemic, serious weather events and climate change, a cyber attack, or a war. Creation of the necessary new transmission networks should not be done in such a way as to cut across the supporting strategy for developing sovereign capability and national resilience in global crises. Involvement of the private sector as contractors in building new transmission networks would of course be a significant contributor to employment and should be encouraged, but only wherever a private company can meet the requirements of other strategies in Australia Together, which seek improvements from private contractors in probity, cost efficiency, and demonstrated commitment to achieving net zero emissions by 2033. The strategy to prohibit government contracts to companies that do not have certified plans for achieving net zero emissions by 2033 is essential to set incentives going in the right direction, namely towards a decarbonised economy, and to achieve that before Australia's fair carbon budget of 3.5 billion tonnes runs out. If we try to do this without a carbon price and without mandating certified plans for polluting companies so that they are properly incentivised to eliminate their emissions, we will not reach net zero before the carbon budget is exhausted. Certification of these emission reduction plans could be managed by the Australian Clean Energy Regulator, alongside expansion of its certification role under another strategy in Australia Together that is central to creating new lucrative international markets for Australia in trade of carbon credits. This brings me to the strategies that can help us create new markets that will flourish in the 21st century global economy. Ethical regulation of emerging carbon credits markets is essential to Australia's success in the 21st century globalised economy. Carbon trading is where Australia can make significant financial gains, and unless we have a credible regulator who can certify that a tonne of sequestered carbon is a genuine tonne of tradable credit, we won't be able to barter with credibility in international carbon markets, and we therefore won't get the value from our investment in carbon sequestration projects. Fortunately for Australia, during our brief period of carbon pricing from 2012 to 2014, a clean energy regulator was established which, among other things, developed an international reputation for defining acceptable approaches to carbon sequestration which could be used to produce genuine carbon credit units. That Australian clean energy regulator survived the demise of the carbon price brought about by the Abbott government in 2014, and it has retained some status as a credible regulator. In 2021, this made the Australian clean energy regulator a valuable asset in emerging markets for carbon and in establishing a foothold for Australian businesses and landowners in international carbon credits trade. One big market that is ready for establishment in carbon trading is, of course, the one that can produce carbon credits by planting trees. Hence, Australia Together includes a strategy suggested by business leaders from the Australian National Outlook in 2019. This is a legislated program to increase GDP and returns to landholders and mitigate climate change at the same time by increasing native forestry cover and restoring degraded ecosystems, including through projects such as soil carbon. But this strategy needs at least 3 other large-scale strategies to ensure the fullest returns for Australia. It needs much more solid financial backing than the current Poultry Emissions Reduction Fund administered by the Australian government. The necessary backing can be delivered by establishment of a publicly owned Carbon in the Land and Sea Finance and Trading Corporation. A second strategy that would be highly effective is to reintroduce a renewable energy target. And of course, it needs a third strategy, to reintroduce a price on carbon. The Carbon in the Land and Sea Finance and Trading Corporation would be authorised to borrow and invest funds in landscape and sea carbon projects, including planting, biodiversity, biomass, kelp, alternative feedstock, and soil carbon projects, and any other projects on both public and private lands and leases which can be reliably measured and certified by the Clean Energy Regulator as having generated a genuine carbon credit in tonnage terms. And the corporation would also be authorised to purchase and trade carbon credits once produced and certified by the Clean Energy Regulator. The decisions of the new corporation about what to invest in would not be limited by requirements to generate commercial rates of return. Returns to the total national economy would instead be maximised by the economic growth and employment this new market would provide, and would be geared to stimulate much quicker entry by Australia into carbon markets. This quicker entry would ensure that the costs of climate change can be substantially reduced through the process of meeting a target for net zero emissions by 2033. Remember, the sooner we meet it, the cheaper it will be, and the more money we make, both as private traders and public funds managers. It would help Australia meet the net zero target quicker if we also reintroduced a National Renewable Energy Target, or RET. Australia introduced its first renewable energy target in 2001, and this worked very effectively to encourage investment in new renewable energy generation. However, when the target was met in 2019, it was not renewed, and investment then waned, leaving our renewable energy generation somewhat stuck at around 27%, or about 18% if we include all sources of power. States have stepped in to fill the gap, and some states, including Tasmania and the ACT, now have 100% renewable energy sources for their electricity. In fact, 2 states, Tasmania and South Australia are now aiming to be net exporters of renewable energy. But the nation could benefit much more if we switched entirely to renewable electricity in the sectors that now use gas or oil, such as transport, minerals processing and smelting. With a national RET and similar policies, we can create an extra 20,000 jobs by 2025, as the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, has shown. We have at least 20,000 reasons there to build renewable electricity generation much faster than we can if we simply rely on state and territory initiatives. We need much more generation of renewable electricity than might arise from the states working in a piecemeal fashion without a clear RET. Such a target is necessary for the speed we need to reach net zero by 2033. Meeting this target will save Australia hundreds of billions of dollars. Indeed, it will save us at least $584 billion over the coming decade, according to research completed by Melbourne Uni in 2019. Put another way, $584 billion is the minimum economic loss to Australia by 2030 if the world does not stop global heating. And by 2050, that loss will grow to at least $762 billion if we let the target slip. Whereas the cost to Australia if the world solves global heating is likely to be in the order of a mere $35 billion, a tiny fraction of our GDP. For more information on the economic consequences of not keeping temperature rises below 1.5 degrees, viewers may like to watch Episode 6 Part 2 of ACFP's YouTube videocast series on the state of Australia in 2020. Amidst all this, reintroduction of a price on carbon is essential. Apart from anything, attempting to meet any carbon emissions reduction target without a carbon price is self-defeating. Not only will it cut returns to Australians, it will significantly slow the pace with which businesses with land or littoral leases opt into carbon in the land and sea projects. And it will slow renewable electricity projects. We only have about 10 years left to keep the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. A carbon price, along with organised publicly owned ethical trading corporations and a strong, credible regulator, are all necessary prerequisites for the speed we need now to keep below the 1.5 degree temperature increase. Viewers interested to find out more about the benefits of reintroducing a price on carbon may wish to read the work of Australia's foremost climate economist, Professor Ross Garnaut. Economists and members of the business sector such as the Australian Industry Group and even the Conservative Business Council of Australia have been calling for the reintroduction of a carbon price since 2019. They now admit that its removal back in 2014 by the Abbott government was a major constraint in Australia's path to economic prosperity. As Professor Garnaut says, there is a large economic prize for Australia if and when we remove that constraint. In particular, a carbon price will be far more effective than strategies relying on technology to get us through. These technology strategies, which are preferred by Australia's coalition government in 2021, are essential, but they are also bound to fail without a carbon price. They simply will not be taken up by industry to anywhere near the extent necessary to defeat the heating problem, because there will be no financial incentive to do so. Public investment by taxpayers in technologies for emissions reduction is desirable, but it is also going to be completely wasted unless it is introduced with carbon pricing or similar market mechanisms that provide incentives for use of these new technologies. All of this brings me to the linchpin of all these strategies, the shift Australia must make from being the least cooperative nation in Paris Agreement negotiations to a nation of leadership in global cooperation, aimed at stopping temperatures rising by more than 1.5 degrees. None of the aforementioned strategies, or indeed any other actions of well-intentioned Australians and decent ethical business planners, is enough to defeat global heating if the rest of the world does not commit to emitting no more than the remaining safe volume of carbon to the atmosphere. If the whole world doesn't stay within that volume limit, then all the money we and other countries put into emissions reduction will be for naught. because the heating will simply overwhelm the planet and our economic capacity to live with it. As ACFP has already said, that safe volume of remaining global carbon emissions is probably about 235 billion tonnes. If the world emits no more than that before we reach net zero, it will give us a near 100% chance of capping temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. For Australia, there are remarkable advantages to committing to a complete turnaround in the way we engage with the rest of the world on climate change. There are so many advantages that it is remarkable that we have not yet insisted that the government make the switch. Instead, we have allowed ourselves and our politicians to be captured by vested corporate interests. We need to rescue ourselves from that. As Ross Garnaut has noted, Australia is more vulnerable than any other developed country to economic losses from climate change, and has more to gain than any other country from the world moving early to zero net emissions necessary for cessation of warming, and from full participation in the global transition to net zero emissions. We have every reason to fully reverse the whole way we have been going about securing a future for ourselves in the 21st century globalised economy. This reversal can be achieved by switching our negotiating stance and conduct in Paris Agreement negotiations. The stance should shift from one where we have been doing our darndest to withhold larger percentage reductions in our emissions, in other words, one where we sit back and do nothing, to one where we take the lead and offer up front a commitment to emit no more than a fair proportional share of the remaining safe load of global emissions, which, as I've already said, is about 235 billion tonnes. This means we should turn up to the 26th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow in November 2021 and propose a new global negotiation and cooperation framework, one that can meet the temperature targets of the Paris Agreement. Instead of each nation pledging percentage reductions in annual emissions, the approach here is for each nation to shift the basis of their pledges to one where they commit to stay within a ceiling for their emissions, a ceiling expressed as tonnes. That is, instead of offering to reduce emissions by percentages, they offer to stay within a maximum permitted load, never emitting more than that agreed ceiling. Each nation's ceiling would be determined using a pre-agreed formula, the basic assumption of which would be that the eventually agreed emissions loads from each individual country would not add up to more than the remaining safe load of global emissions, somewhere around 235 billion tonnes. This shift in the basis of negotiations is necessary because the current basis, using percentage reductions, is bound to fail the temperature targets and therefore will cost each and every nation more than they will ever gain by sticking with the old percentage reduction approach. The new suggested framework will involve abandoning the easily escapable and plainly unsuccessful framework that has so far relied on each nation's willingness to make voluntary pledges of percentage reductions of annual emissions. This voluntary pledging approach was successful in encouraging countries into the Paris Agreement in 2015, but for a number of reasons it will not be successful in achieving the temperature targets, and as such has now outlived its usefulness. Apart from anything, the percentage reduction approach gives each country no idea of whether there will be sufficient support for them to meet the targets, and no idea of the benefits of the mutual cooperation that can only arise from mapping out a plan where every country can see the upper limit of what will be expected from them, and what support they will get as they plan their way to capping emissions at the ceiling, if they're not a developed country, or what support they will be asked to give if they are a developed country. The missing piece of the necessary mapped out plan is the tonnage limit for emissions. This is a target that is not yet the centre of the negotiations, and until it becomes the centre, until it replaces the current target, which is still being expressed as net zero emissions by a date that ignores the reality of the necessary limits on the total tonnages, we will not reach net zero before the high temperatures are locked in. Nobody wins if we fail on the temperature target. For this reason, the conference organisers should be receptive to this alternative approach, and because we have so much to gain from it, Australia should lead this new approach by proposing a motion to the Glasgow conference. That motion could run along the following lines. Australia proposes that a new basis of negotiation within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change should be established to meet the temperature targets of the Paris Agreement, and that this should henceforth be based on pledges to stay permanently within specified total tonnage limits for emissions, such tonnage limits per country to be determined by the following formula. A predetermined budget of total global emissions necessary to ensure a near 100% probability of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius, probably no more than 235 billion tonnes between 2020 and whenever net zero is reached by all countries, multiplied by B, the percentage of the total load of global carbon emitted by each country to the atmosphere in 2019. In Australia's case, this would be roughly equivalent to 235 billion tonnes multiplied by 1.5%, which is the approximate proportion of global emissions from domestic sources in Australia in 2019. If the formula were accepted, this would give Australia a final carbon budget of approximately 3.5 billion tonnes. This would mean that Australia could emit no more than 3.5 billion tonnes ever, which may seem harsh and difficult, given that if we keep emitting at the rate of around 500 million tonnes per annum as we are now, we will exhaust that budget in less than 7 years. But it is no harder for us than it would be for any other nation. For Australia, it is easier than most, and not at all unachievable, to stay within that budget and achieve net zero in about 12 years, if we start now. Imagine how we'd all feel if in 12 years we had got on top of climate change. It's worth the effort. We have time and money enough to do it, and the rewards will far outweigh the cost for Australia. In fact, it is by far the easiest and cheapest way to do things for every nation. Australia could boost its success in brokering for such a proposal if at the same time it offered to reinstate its support for contributions to the United Nations Green Climate Fund. In 2018, Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced over Talkback Radio that Australia would no longer, quote, tip money into that big climate fund, unquote. This is entirely inconsistent with our signature on the Paris Agreement, and it's now necessary to restore our nation's bona fides in financial commitments if we wish to reap the benefits that only come with keeping temperature rises within the 1.5 degree limit. Temperature rises above that will cost us far more than the small cost of reaching net zero before the global carbon budget is blown. In fact, it would not be an unreasonable or unethical negotiation tactic at this point if Australia were to leverage its position by saying openly that Australia will rejoin the Green Climate Fund if an environment of certainty can be created via a shift by the whole world into a new system of pledges proposed by Australia. That system being that everyone base their pledges on emitting no more than their fair shares of the total remaining safe global carbon budget. Naturally, there will be arguments about whether the percentage shares are fair or not, but this is an easier argument to resolve if the overall principle is accepted, and it can be resolved easily if the developed countries like Australia work out what financial assistance will be needed for the underdeveloped countries and make the necessary commitment to them. We can't work that out unless every nation has a clear idea of what they can safely emit before they reach net zero and has submitted a plan of costed actions to meet their target. Once we have those plans, developed nations can sort out what they will need to contribute, and they will have greater surety that their money will not be wasted. This is a transparent way to embed fairness and reason into these make or break international negotiations. It is also likely the only way to achieve Australia's necessary environmental and economic objectives. Without this certainty, certainty that can only be provided with this new negotiating basis, no nation will enter into agreements that have the potential to lead to success in capping global heating before the carbon budget is blown. But if we reverse the negotiating framework now, replacing it with commitments to work within fair carbon ceilings, we have a chance of fixing global heating. What do we get out of this proposal as a nation? What do we get out of encouraging the world to shoot for the tightest carbon budget of 235 billion tonnes now? What do we get out of re-gearing our economy within the decade to ensure we emit no more than 1.5% of the remaining safe greenhouse gas loads and reduce our emissions at similar rates to everyone else? What do we get out of switching from carbon-intensive exports to exports of carbon credits and goods built with renewable energy? We rescue our economy. We rescue our reputation as a trustworthy trading partner, something we need more than ever now if we are to rebuild markets lost recently due to the deterioration of our relationship with our biggest trading partner, China. And most of all, we rescue the planet and everything it means to our safety, security, and well-being. It is not possible to rescue these things with our current uncooperative negotiating stance. Australia could further enhance its chances of success in climate change negotiations and the 21st century global economy if, in addition to signing back into the Green Climate Fund, we also took our other commitments in the United Nations programs seriously. The most significant of these is our commitment to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These are goals the Australian government signed on to in 2015 to do things like eliminate poverty and hunger in Australia, ensure affordable access to education, including tertiary education, and yes, take urgent action to combat climate change and to do it all by 2030. And yet, at no time since making those commitments to sustainable development has the federal government seen fit to either develop a plan for meeting the goals or dedicate funding for that purpose. In some cases, Australia is going backwards. For example, tertiary education is getting less affordable than ever. Australia would benefit greatly from recommitting to these goals, developing clear, dedicated plans to meet them, funding them, and establishing a citizens' assembly for monitoring progress towards the adopted SDGs by 2030. This sort of citizen engagement on something that is vital for world economic stability and for peace and security would enhance Australia's capacity to transition through the decade to a new economy more surely than we otherwise might. It could help the world rebuild its trust in Australia as a decent trading partner, and it could help Australians rebuild their trust in their government, something they've lost over the last decade, especially insofar as climate change is concerned. Most of all, it would help Australians build social cohesion, an essential ingredient in defeating climate change. Climate change is something we can only defeat if we act together as a compassionate society. It would substantially boost confidence in the Australian economy and prospects for a cohesive and more resilient society in the future if we took our commitments to international development goals seriously and faithfully adhered to the agreements we make. At the start of this program, I said that climate change will not be solved without an integrated plan, one that helps us address all the causes of climate change at the same time and together as Australians. We must work on multiple integrated fronts simultaneously if we are to solve climate change before it's too late. Australia Together is a plan that allows us to make the necessary links, integrating all the key strategies as they emerge. But if there is one strategy that boosts the potential for success, it is of course the strategy to reform Australia's negotiating stance in the Paris Agreement and commit to emitting no more than a fair share of the remaining global carbon budget. None of the other strategies can work if we don't take a leadership stance on the global stage. To that end, I would like to encourage viewers to sign the petition launched by Australian Community Futures Planning, where we demand that the Australian government lead the world at COP26 to stop global heating. Australia can restore its place in the concert of nations by taking a leadership role at COP26. And it is time for Australians to insist that our governments and we as a nation do everything possible to stop global heating. The prize for Australia and our children is a big one, but we can only win it if we start now. Links to the petition that Australia lead the world at COP26 to stop global heating are provided in the description below. Thanks for watching this episode. If you like this program, please click like on the YouTube page and share the program with your friends and subscribe to this channel.